What's the significant difference between the bottom one and the upper two?
Well, the bottom one, they do it themselves, and the upper two.
Say that out loud. That's exactly right. You can't do this to them. They are the ones that have to break that moral code. They're the ones that have to break that. Now, you could set circumstances up such that they may do it, but in the end, they have to make that decision. See, physically, we can isolate ourselves, but we also can isolate others. Mentally, we can isolate ourselves, or we also can isolate others. But morally, they have to do it to themselves. That's exactly right.
You can help them along.
I said that's correct. Particularly if they're weak. You know, you put them on events, and pretty soon they start the finger pointing and all that kind of stuff. They start doing things that violate their moral codes and that. But in the end, they have to make that decision. And that's why it's very important to get a good moral code and live by it, because when the squeeze comes on, what happens then? You hang in there. And if you don't have it, the whole goddamn thing comes apart. And remember I said the other day, therefore your control is exercised through what? Your moral value. People have an obsession for control. That's where you really exercise control. And the reason why it's important is because it bears upon everybody, the leader as well as the lowest guy, from private to commonwealth. And that's why it's important when I said the only way leaders can do it is by example. If they start violating that stuff, the guys down below are they're going to violate that group too. Next thing you know, the whole thing comes apart. And that's why people violate, they should have their ass kicked right out. Because they're not doing it. I mean, we make mistakes, we're not perfect, but they should fess up to it and try to correct it. If they do that, you admire people who do that. But when they deliberately try to hide something or paper it over, that's a problem. That's a lousy example. And so the junior people can respect the leader that abides by that code. You say, well, he's no different than I am. Beautiful. Therefore, you got control without going for it. The other way, you try to set the road and make people behave like the automatons. They all try to leak away from it any way they can. So the only discipline that really counts is what then? Self-discipline. And so your job as officers or NCOs is to build up the self-discipline. You have to always impose it externally. It tells you something. Or else you're not getting through. And that comes out of moral codes and everything. That's why it's so important. I can't overemphasize it. Okay? And so then here's the expected payoff. You can do it. Isolation. Okay? Let's turn the argument around now. What I'm saying, making many channels of communication outside the world. In other words, interact in many different channels. Then you stay in touch with the world. Remember what I told you? You can think of people being a narrowband or a wideband filter. A narrowband filter can't read a wideband filter, but a wideband filter can read a narrowband filter. So you want to put your adversary in the narrowband mode, you want to be in the wideband mode. I think we got a communications guy, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? You can think of that. Physicists say that you want to operate a wide frequency spectrum, put your adversary in a narrow frequency spectrum. You can read him, he can't read you. Or he can't read much of it. Of course, he can read a little bit of it, but I mean overall. Of course, it might be leaving the most important part outside his bandwidth. If you want a wide bandwidth, give him a narrow bandwidth. You know what I'm saying? Once again, it's like information from a variety of sources. And when I made that point, many signs of implicit cross-referencing process, which we're going to bring up again and again. Because that will help you then generate these mental images and that match up with what's going on out there. So if you can cut that off from your adversary, we talked about that, ambiguity, deception, indistinctness, etc. What you're trying to do is narrow down the view of the world so we can play with it. And morally, we enact by avoiding mismatches between what we say we are and what we are in the world we have to deal with. In fact, I'm going to bring this out in a much better way after we're done with this presentation. The end of that, in fact, the key idea is mismatches and match-up. That's the key idea. What I call mismatches and motherhood. M&M. In fact, we used to call the Pentagon guys used to work it on somebody else. We said, well, we'll use the candy strategy, M&M the candy strategy. We set up a mismatches and motherhood. Christ, they go down to 2 every time. In fact, Tower, we got him doing that at one time. We were getting something done over the hill. He says, Christ, how can I fight this? This is goddamn motherhood. And he didn't realize he tumbled onto our strategy. He said, I can't fight this. This is motherhood. I'll explain what that is in a minute. Go ahead.
But the second half of your sentence.
Which one?
Is, the last one, morally. Are you trying to say that we have to adapt our codes to others?
No, I didn't say that. You better be sure your code's inclusive enough. Like the Nazis had a nice code that took care of themselves, but they alienated everybody else, and they went down to goddamn tubes. So if you take an exclusive moral code that fits a small group, but it actually makes everybody else's enemy, you're not in good shape, right?
As long as that code is not diametrically opposed to your own, you can.
We're going to get into that. Just hang on to that. Hang on to that. Hang on to that. We're going to get into that in just a minute. You're exactly right. As long as it's not diametrically opposed.
Keep using the word adversary. And in a strategy in peacetime, when there's no clear-cut adversary, creates problems. I remember Henry Kissinger said that countries don't have friends, countries have interests. And when the interests coincide, then friendship occurs. That's right.
Okay.
So the term adversary.
I've got it here in terms of a two-way street. I agree with that. I'm going to show you in a different. We're going to broaden that view.
Because I mean, Great Britain, Argentina was a friend, but yet we provided Great Britain.
I can't put it all in the first chart. You got to let me lay it out sequentially. I'm going to get it. Right now, I'm focused on sort of a two-sided game. See what I'm saying? You're right. But if our interests are opposed to theirs, you become adversaries. And Kissinger's problem is he regards himself as being a real politician. Real politician. He goes by real politician. And they get mad when they bring up the moral. They say, we don't want to deal with the moral crap. That's the most important part. I'll bring it out. See what I'm saying here then? Okay, let's broaden the issue. Okay. So expected payoff. Okay? Now, to pull it all together, this is partially getting into what you're saying here. What do I say? Potential adversary. You might have different interests. See what I'm saying there? And current adversaries, as well as the unconvinced that are drawn toward our philosophy and empathy toward our way of life. Now this is what you do. This is what I call a positive sign and there's a negative sign. You have to be able to. Now, anybody detect the subtlety in that chart? What have I done differently as opposed to what I laid out previously? I did this. I played the same game with you when I did the patterns. Remember, I start from the negative side of the house and went to the positive. Here I'm going from the positive to the negative. You always want to emphasize the positive. In order to understand the positive, you can't, in order to have a Christ, you've got to have an antichrist. Otherwise, you've got to come in from the back side. It's mathematics. In order to prove something, you have to do it from the falsehood side. But in the end, you want to turn it around and emphasize the positive. No, I didn't say do this. You have to be able to so you don't get hosed later on. So always come in from the positive side. Don't come down, it's better to use, what they say, honey and what was it? Vinegar. Now, if they don't take the honey, then you're justified. Remember, we talked about that the other day. Okay. Now, let's look at implementation. And we're going to start answering that point you made up, somebody made up in a minute. We can start getting into it here. Yeah. The way of thinking about it. So what I call a moral design for grand strategy. Remember I said grand strategy should be more constructive, not destructive. So here's the name of the game. Remember, you got to look at it from three sides. Sun Tzu said, know your enemy, know yourself. Know your enemy, know yourself, and know those third parties out there. In his world, you didn't have to worry about too much about that because they didn't have communication. They could knock somebody off before anybody else knew about it. Nowadays, Christ is moving anything. It's around the world in seconds. And you know the guerrillas and the terrorists, those people take full advantage of that modern communications. Okay, with respect to ourselves, you better once again set the example. You got to look at it two ways. Don't try to paper this stuff over, face up to it, and start correcting it. We often take the second part and try to paper this over, and it causes problems. In fact, the politicians like to take this part and paper this over and get in deep trouble. How many people here have ever read Machiavelli, The Prince? What's the key message there, John?
I don't know, sir.
Well, if you read it, what it is, it's the way I look at politics. Remember, the prince, he's looked at four basic groups in it. The prince and the people he dealt with. His ministers, the nobles with their constituents, and the people. And when you look at the game he was playing, it was a very dirty game in order to get, in order to control the thing. And so really it was the way I define politics. The art of manipulating others for advantage. That's what the prince was doing all the way through being letter. And interestingly enough, though, Machiavelli, remember, he wrote that in the 16th century. He understood something. Item one, it's easy to control the ministers because you can fire and hire those you do. The nobles is tougher. Because they have constituents. You get them, they may line up against you, you got a big problem. You got to play one off the other and all that. He said, in the end, you can't trust them, nor can you trust your minister. He says, if the squeeze comes on, what you really want is you want the people on your side. Because if you have the people on your side, then you can control the ministers and the nobles. And when the squeeze comes on, you can make it. Well, isn't that interesting? Because that's the same thing in guerrilla warfare. People. And he wrote this in the 16th century. Right? Except he was doing it from a negative viewpoint. Okay? Now let's look with respect to our adversaries. We should. Don't let them get away with stuff. You're going to play that game, that second reveals mismatches, don't live in a guy's house because he's going to smash you too. You want to have a better example, then you have enormous leverage. Okay? The last one. Now this is the third party. This was somebody mentioned that before. You have to look at other party. On culture. We're going to make it very clear to them by that second statement. I think you were the one to raise that, right? Just because they have a different culture, you don't want to say, well, they're bastards, we're going to take them out. As long as they don't try to undermine yours, you can realize you have to learn how to get along with people. Because we all don't have the same cultures now. But too often, because they don't have an American culture, we want to Americanize the globe and cause enormous problems. I think that's what you were alluding to. On the other hand, they start trying to unwind us, we get a little disturbed too. In other words, it's a delicate act you got to play. Okay? So therefore, here's what we've been talking about all the way through, and then I want to give you something else this time. Here's the way I like to look at strategy. What is strategy? A mental scheme or design for harmonizing focus nerves. In other words, that's the captain base for harmonizing focus nerves. For realizing aim for an unfolding often of many people and many contending interests. Somebody used the word interest back there. In other words, you have to be able to look at it from many different what? Viewpoints or perspectives. Exactly right. And what is the aim or purpose of strategy? Whether it's individuals, as groups, or the nation states, so we can survive on our own terms. In other words, we don't want to be hammered in the ground by somebody else. We want to have some control over our own survival. So we can thrive and grow. And what is the central theme? We're always working this interaction isolation. I'm going to come out and make it more vivid in a moment.
It seems very theoretically it's not a good deal.
I didn't say it was hard. I didn't say it was easy to do.
But there seems to be competing interests all the time.
Probably.
The state, Department of Defense, I mean, everybody's got, so we're fighting among ourselves trying to figure out what our angle is.
Well, every society has contending. What you have to do is you want to get yours more in harmony than somebody else's. So you can cope with the outside. And of course, the way of doing that is if you get something like the Ayatollah, if you get somebody's evil source out there, then you harmonize your people more together. In other words, you have a more menacing external source, like we had during World War II. You know, our country was all divided, really unified when we had to go to war. We have a hard time unifying when we don't have an outside pressure. In fact, this is what the Russians said here. Remember, what's his name? The advisor to Gorbachev. He says, you know, you're going to have a hard time against us. We're going to take ourselves away as being your enemy.
That's right. I mean, why do we keep?
Now, how you going to? We're not going to. The only way you can deal with us because you think it was enemy. We're not going to be your enemy, and then we want to see you deal with us.
You know, we could never be tolerated.
You heard that? That statement's been made. Who's Gorbachev's guy? The guy that the guy's head of their American Arbatov. What's his name? No, he's dead. The guy that's Georgy Arbatov, or whatever his name is, he's the one that said it. He told our Secretary of State, you're going to have a hard time because what happens when we take ourselves away as being your enemy? What are you going to do then? Because everything you've laid out is because we're an enemy.
So we would never be welcome with military forces in Europe if we were to Warsaw Pact.
Well, look at already what's happened.
Welcome in Poland.
Well, look at already what's happened. Kohl has gotten all the Europeans to go against their idea of the nuclear weapons over there. The only ones hanging in there is Thatcher on our side. Remember, he's got everybody else turned around. So they're having some success at that strategy. I'm trying to tell you. Now, the bottom one here. The point is, these are very nice. If you can't do this, the bottom one's the most important one. If you can't do this, you'll never realize the above. If you can't do what I say at the bottom, the last statement here, you'll never be able to realize what's above it. That's important. Because the world's always changing. What I'm really suggesting here, you got to be able to build snowmobiles all the time. And be able to employ them appropriately. So if you can't do this, you're not going to be able to realize the above. That's the most important. Now, having said that, let's go through a little exercise. What did we talk about in the strategy? We talked about one, interaction isolation. We talked about it across the moral, the mental, and physical dimensions, right? And we looked at it various ways. Now let's look at the world out. We have a situation, right? We have to take actions in order to deal with the situation, right? We have to have ideas in order to concoct the actions to deal with the situation, right? Then we have to have some ideals or values, whatever you want to call about, that would we embed our ideas, our actions, or situation. So I'm going to have four things. Ideals, which is related primarily to the moral. Ideas, which are primarily related to the mental. Actions, which are primarily related to the physical. And a situation we have to deal with, whether it's enemy or otherwise, right? Okay, let's take the physical dimension first. We look at the physical dimension. We have actions versus situation. We want to get a matchup between our actions and our situation so we can deal with it. If we have a mismatch, we can't cope, right? So M&M, matchup, mismatch. I call it matchup, that's mother. You got it right. You got the matchup. You got harmony. You got the connections. And so armies, in some sense, realize part of that, or military. What they try to do is cut the other guy's lines of communication. What are you doing? You're trying to generate that, take away a source of that part of it. See what I'm saying? Now let's go to the mental. Now the ideas are related to the mental. And the ideas have to be related to the actions and the situation. So you get a mismatch between ideas and actions and a mismatch between ideas and situation. Likewise, a matchup between the two. So now you have two M&Ms. You got one M&M between actions and situation, two M&Ms, mismatch or matchups between ideas, one between ideas and actions, one between ideas and situation. Okay, now let's go up to the moral dimension, or ideals. Ideals are related to the moral. So you can get a mismatch between your ideals and your ideas, between your ideals and actions, and between ideals and situations. Likewise, a matchup. So there's three M&Ms there. Got one M&M in the physical dimension, two in the mental dimension, and three in the moral dimension. If you add them up, you got a total of 6 M&Ms. Now the ones most people tend to operate on in the military are only one, for the physical. So they only got 1/6 of it at the best. If you don't do it perfectly, you don't even get 1/6 of it. If you bring in the mental dimension, you can get half of it. Mental and physical. 2 plus 1 is 3. If you bring in the moral, you got all 6. Even if you don't operate perfectly, at least you're considering all 6. Well, Kissinger throws out the moral because I don't want to hear about that moral crap. So he's given away half the farm. That's the nature of real politics. They don't want to deal with it. So they say. If they really had real politics, you would deal with it very directly. You understand what I just told you? You all see what I'm getting at here? Now, let me tell you something. The physical is the easiest one to understand. The mental is the quickest to get leverage on somebody. But the moral is the strongest. You gain moral leverage, you've got all kinds of leverage. Not only that, isn't it curious? You get 3 in the moral and 1 in the physical, which also agrees with Napoleon's statement. The moral is the physical is 3 to 1. I mean, I didn't make it come out that way. It just turns out when I look at it in that sense. So you generate more mismatches and matchups in the moral. In other words, not only can you have more matchups, but it's also easier to screw up in terms of mismatches. But also, if you learn how to pay attention, that you can gain more leverage over your adversary. So the whole, what's my point, winding it up then? The whole interaction isolation game is based upon then mismatches and matchups, or matchups and mismatches. And that's what you're trying to generate. And when if you do your maneuver warfare or any kind of warfare correctly, what are you trying to generate is those mismatches in your adversary so he can't function, so you get those isolation schemes. On the other hand, you want to be able to read the environment better than he can, so you get more matchups than he has. You're not mismatches, therefore you get the interaction, he has the isolation.
Deharmonize.
Deharmonizing or disharmonizing, that's right. So the more mismatches I can get into a system, doesn't that magnify his friction or pump up his entropy? Absolutely. It's all related. John, you look perplexed. Something bother you?
Just follow me, sir.
This John here.
I'm trying to follow it, sir. I don't know how successful I am.
Here's some definitions I have there. Evil. People like to talk about good and evil. Evil occurs when this happens. When individuals or groups embrace codes of conduct and behavior for their own personal well-being and social improvement, yet violate those in order to undermine the well-being and social approval of others, that's evil. How many people here read the that one written by Alan Bloom, the Opposing the Dark Mind? How many did you read that? Remember, he defined good. He went back to Aristotle. Aristotle defined good. How did he define it? I'll paraphrase, not exactly. He's trying to say it. He didn't get it quite right. The way he laid it out was those ideas and actions that permit us to thrive and grow, or to flourish and grow. That's what Aristotle said. He's partly right, not quite all right. We really want to have the ultimate good. It's those ideas and actions that permit us to flourish and grow without denying others that same opportunity. Or it's strange. If you thrive and grow, the Nazis tried to grow themselves, but they were holding everybody else. I don't think we call it good. And here, you're depriving those others to thrive and grow. Is what I'm trying to say. That's evil. When you thrive and grow at the expense of others, it's not too good. It's not evil. And so that's the problem when people at the higher level try to present themselves being one way when they're another way, and they're using that as a basis for gaining leverage over others. You start to violate moral codes. That's why it's important for the leader to set the example. If he doesn't set the example, when the squeeze comes on, he needs people to be there. They're not going to be there. Instead, the finger pointing and all that begins. Go ahead.
I hope you can explain to me, I got heartburn when you say that all orders should be verbal, and I hate paperwork, but nevertheless, I remember playing the games when you were a kid, and making
Well, I'm
things
just saying,
simple.
I just tend to like verbal orders because I know things can be done faster. And I ran 2 goddamn fighter programs that way. You should see all the paperwork they have now. Hell, I laid out the design trade-offs, the F-15, the F-X became the F-15, also the lightweight fighter. They did it all by telephone and personal thing. Only very few guys really wants to get that goddamn shit out of here. I know what has to be done. I tell the guys, you got it, fine. And if they didn't have it, did it wrong, if they made a mistake, I knew they were holding out the window.
But what you're going to talk about is how things get lost in communication.
Well, the,
really, I
the
think
first
we're
guy
getting
got the
design
10th,
well.
which is not even close.
Yeah, but that's because there are reasons for that.
The reasons for that.
If you have the
Aren't you
same
reading
group,
human nature and getting it and trying to, let's say, hit problems off before they occur? If maybe you give even a small or just something as a reminder to an individual,
there's
especially
another
more complex
dimension.
situations.
There's another dimension which will come out in an organic design.
Yeah.
If this group here played that game now, and you started the message, it would be quite different when we got there. If we played that game for a week, I bet we could get the message all the way around.
Not if if it was the same message, but you go out in the field.
I don't think so.
Oh, I don't know.
That's why you want to have multiple interactions. Because then when you interact multiply with other people, pretty soon you start building up similar orientations. And that not only that, each one acts as a check and balance on the other. That's how you do it. But if you have a single chain of command, you're only operating through one pipeline all the time, you can have exactly what you're talking about.
I know, but let me take one of
In
your.
fact, Balk, you know what Balk used to say when he sent a message out? General Balk, he said, then he'd go down the other end and see what arrived. He said, boy, it was very different. He said, God damn it. And then he'd try to find out and gradually began to get that thing sorted out.
So what about when you've done? You've made a case for unit cohesion.
Oh yeah, but what I'm saying is you bring it down to a physical level, and let's say when we go to the field and in the fog of war, you're tired, you're being shot at, and you're doing this, and even though you've been working together for 3 years, and your guy gets over here, gets shot, and he's one man out of the link, all I'm saying is that when it goes around there, the more tired people become, the more confused and frustrated physically they get, things are gonna, let's say, distranslate as they go along. And a piece of paper may help. I don't like paperwork, I'm not saying the 5-paragraph order is it, but I'm trying to hit things off, the problems, before they occur. So I don't distrust people. Let's say I'm trying to understand human nature and accept human nature. And that's not distrust.
Balk said the best way to give an order. I mean, he did it. And also, you heard of, I'm sure the Army guys heard of him, so-called Professor Wood, John Wood, considered probably the best armored commander in the U.S. Army. Considered the best. Remember, what he did after they made the breakout, he had a division spread out on a 500-mile front. He had Combat Command A, Combat Command B, they had Combat Commands, Combat Command C. You know how he operated? He was a goddamn Piper Cub. He was going out there talking to this guy, moving over to that guy. And that's all he did all the way through. And they went like, they might have been confused, but I'll tell you one goddamn thing, the other guy was more confused. Remember what I told you, as long as the other guy's more confused. It's the same old thing when Terry Allen, what he wanted to do, he tried to train at night. They said, we can't train at night, it's confusing. He said, that's right. But if our guys are used to it more than the other guy, he's going to be more confused. We're going to leverage the hell out of him. So he used night attack. Night attacks are pretty goddamn good if you know what you're doing. Isn't that what the guerrillas did to us many times? Mike, you were over there. Who was over there, right? Huh? Rommel? Yeah. But the point is, see, Knight's confused. See what happened to goddamn Clausewitz? He put in there, he didn't like night attacks. He didn't like this and that because all he was doing, he was focused inward, looking at his own confusion and disorder, his own uncertainty, his own friction. So I raised my friction. If I can raise the other guy's higher than mine, I got leverage. I can pull his pants down. And so if the other guy's laying out this 5-paragraph order and he's got to transmit all this way, in the meantime, we're cycling through faster. He's out of date. He's got this nice order that's always out of date. And that's what the French were. They were out of date from the goddamn beginning to the end.
How about adapt to the situation? Just give him a...
In fact, Rommel said, not Rommel, like Balk, when I talked to him, he said he's one of his best guys he had, in fact, was an Austrian. He said, Christ, he told him what to do, and he said, get back to me. He said, he didn't have to talk to him about once a week, and he didn't know what to do. He'd just check in every once. Okay, I'm still doing it. I'm on my way. He said, on the other hand, other guys didn't know what they were doing. He wanted them very carefully. Were you here the other night when I said about you want to have, that's one thing about a command and control system. It implies only one way to operate, and really the command and control system, if you know your people, is multidimensional. You're going to give some guys a longer leash than others. And see, that's what our so-called hardware doesn't come near to terms with or even accommodate. And that's why Balk said it's very important you know your people. Because once you know your people, then you can just decide how you can apportion your time to them to realize what you want to realize.
Didn't the Merck have a guy on his staff?
Yeah.
Whatever he said, they did the opposite. It whatever his recommendation.
Yes, Chuck, that's a good story. Go ahead, say it. Come.
Well, that's all I really remember. But I know he had a guy, and he knew that whatever his plan was the worst thing, the last thing they ever wanted to do. So they asked him.
Yeah, well, in fact, the subordinates were trying to get Hindenburg to fire him. The subordinates came to Hindenburg and said, "What do you keep this guy on board? He's a loser. He's always wrong." He said, "Let me explain it to you very carefully." And Hindenburg said, "What I do is I give it to him. And when he says it's okay, he says, I know it has to be redone because he's doing it wrong. When he says it's screwed up, he says, I know it's ready to roll."
Yeah, then they do it.
When the guy's always wrong, that's information too.